My name is Clara Reed. I'm 34 years old, and until recently, I was a senior operations manager at a mid-sized consulting firm in Chicago. If you met me in a meeting, you probably wouldn't remember me right away. I'm not the loudest voice in the room. I don't interrupt. I don't perform confidence with big gestures or rehearsed charisma. I take notes. I listen. I ask one or two questions that cut through the noise. For years, people mistook that for softness. Colleagues described me as steady and dependable and low maintenance. It sounds like praise, doesn't it? But in corporate language, those words can quietly translate into something else. She won't push back. She won't ask for more. She'll handle it. And I did. I handled impossible deadlines. I handled clients that senior partners didn't want to deal with. I handled projects that were already on fire before they landed on my desk. I handled the emotional labor of smoothing over conflicts that weren't mine to fix. What I didn't handle, at least not well, was what was happening underneath all of it. The subtle rewrites of history. The meetings where my ideas were repeated back to me by someone else and suddenly applauded. The salary conversations that somehow always ended with, maybe next quarter. The gentle, smiling gaslighting made me question my own memory. This story isn't about a dramatic revenge arc. It's not about me storming out in a blaze of glory while everyone claps. It's about something quieter. It's about the moment I slammed my resignation letter on my boss's desk. It's about walking out in the middle of a high-stakes meeting after years of being gaslit and underpaid. But more importantly, it's about everything that happened before that moment, and everything that changed inside me long before anyone else noticed. Because when I finally snapped, it didn't look like chaos. It looked calm. This is a story about emotional erosion. About being underestimated until you almost believe the smaller version of yourself that others prefer. About realizing that silence can either be surrender or strategy. I won't exaggerate. I won't turn anyone into a villain. Most of the people in this story would probably say they were just doing business. But business has a way of revealing what people truly believe you're worth. And eventually, you have to decide whether you agree with them. Have you ever stayed somewhere longer than you should have, just because you thought enduring quietly was the mature thing to do? To them, I was the safe one. That's the word I think fits best now. Not brilliant. Not indispensable. Not leadership material, just safe. If a client was frustrated, I was the one sent in to smooth it over. If a project was behind schedule, it somehow landed on my desk with a tight smile and a, "Clara, you're so good at organizing chaos." If two departments were quietly at war, I became the diplomatic buffer. In performance reviews, I was described as consistent, reliable, emotionally steady, never strategic, never visionary, never future partner, and I accepted that framing for longer than I care to admit. In meetings, I was the one who had already read every attachment. I knew the numbers behind the projections, the contractual fine print, the timeline risks no one else bothered to calculate. But I delivered my input gently, calmly, without theatrics. When I'd say, "There's a 17% cost overrun risk if we approve this vendor," it was noted. When Mark, my boss, would say 5 minutes later, "We need to be careful about hidden cost escalations," it was praised. "Exactly," someone would nod. "That's sharp thinking." I remember the first time that happened. I told myself it was an accident, a misunderstanding. Maybe I hadn't been clear enough. After the 5th or 6th time, it wasn't confusing anymore. It was a pattern. But patterns are easy to ignore when you benefit from being liked. And I was liked. No one rolled their eyes when I spoke. No one openly dismissed me. I wasn't bullied. I wasn't shouted at. I wasn't excluded from meetings. I was included in everything, just not credited. There's a specific kind of invisibility that doesn't look like neglect. It looks like appreciation. Clara will handle it. Clara's got it. We don't need to worry. Clara's on it. It sounds empowering, until you realize no one ever asks what Clara wants in return. I trained 3 junior associates who were later promoted ahead of me. I built onboarding systems that cut operational errors by nearly 30%. I streamlined reporting structures that reduced client churn. Those metrics were real, documented, measurable. But when leadership discussed growth strategy, I was asked to capture notes and circle back with action items. I was 34 years old, managing accounts worth millions, and still being gently assigned administrative roles in executive meetings. The strangest part? I started participating in my own diminishment. When salary review season came around, I rehearsed my case in my head. I knew the numbers, I knew the revenue I had protected. I knew the clients who had privately told me they stayed because of me. But when I sat across from Mark in his glass-walled office, Watching the reflection of the city in the background, my voice would soften. I just wanted to revisit compensation, I'd say carefully, given the expanded scope of my responsibilities. He'd nod sympathetically. You're doing great work, Clara. You know that. Budgets are tight this quarter. Let's reevaluate soon. Soon never arrived. And because he said it warmly, because he smiled, because he called me a cornerstone of the team, I walked out feeling reassured instead of underpaid. That's how it works sometimes. No one needs to insult you if they can simply delay you. To them, I was mature, low drama, not ambitious in a disruptive way. I wore tailored blazers in neutral tones. I spoke in measured sentences. I didn't gossip. I didn't compete loudly. And somewhere along the way, that composure became evidence, at least in their minds, that I didn't need more. They assumed I was content because I wasn't complaining. What they never asked was whether my silence came from peace or calculation. At the time, though, it wasn't calculation. It was endurance. I believed that if I just kept performing at a high level, if I stayed patient, professional, composed, the recognition would naturally follow. Merit rises, right? That's what I told myself. I was the dependable one, the stabilizer, the adult in the room. I just didn't realize that in their story, stabilizers don't rise. They absorb, and absorption has a cost. The first small cut didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like a scheduling oversight. We were preparing for a quarterly strategy presentation with one of our largest clients, a healthcare network that accounted for nearly 18% of our firm's annual revenue. I had spent 3 weeks restructuring their operational rollout plan. Late nights, Saturday spreadsheets, quiet recalculations after everyone else had gone home. I built a new framework that reduced projected implementation time by 6 weeks. I mapped out contingency triggers. I even drafted the talking points so leadership could present them cleanly. 2 days before the meeting, I received the updated calendar invite. The presenters were listed at the top: Mark, 2 senior partners, and Daniel, one of the associates I had trained the previous year. My name was nowhere. At first, I assumed it was an error. I forwarded the invite to Mark. Hey, I noticed I'm not on the presentation roster. Just wanted to confirm I'll still be covering the operations segment. He responded 10 minutes later. Oh, we're streamlining voices for this one. You'll be in the room, of course. Might be helpful if you handle live note capture and follow-up documentation. Streamlining voices. I stared at that phrase longer than I should have. In the conference room that Friday, I sat slightly off-center at the long glass table. My black leather notebook is open, my pen aligned perfectly parallel to the edge. Daniel presented the implementation framework. My framework. He used my slides, almost verbatim. He even used a phrase I tend to say, operational elasticity. And for a moment I felt something tighten in my chest. The client's CEO leaned forward. This is impressive. Cutting 6 weeks off the rollout is significant. Who led this analysis? There was a half-second pause. Mark answered. Daniel spearheaded it with support from the team. Support from the team. I remember the air conditioning humming, the faint smell of catered coffee, the way my heartbeat suddenly felt loud in my ears. Daniel didn't correct him. He didn't look at me. He just nodded modestly. Collaborative effort, he added. And that was it. No malice, no smirk, no dramatic theft. Just a quiet redirection of credit that landed cleanly and permanently. I wrote in my notebook, even though I wasn't taking notes. I wrote the date, I wrote the client's name, and I wrote very simply, credit reassigned. I didn't confront anyone afterward. I told myself it wasn't worth destabilizing relationships over one presentation. I told myself leadership politics were complicated. I told myself Daniel probably felt awkward and didn't know how to interject. On the drive home, I rehearsed imaginary conversations in my head. Hey, I noticed. I just wanted clarity on. Going forward, I'd appreciate. But by the time I parked in my apartment garage, my tone had softened again. Maybe I was being sensitive. Maybe I hadn't positioned myself strongly enough beforehand. Maybe visibility is something you claim, not something you wait to receive. That night, I opened my laptop and reviewed the compensation bands for similar roles in comparable firms. I already knew the answer, but seeing the numbers still stung. I was underpaid by at least 22%. The next Monday, Daniel stopped by my desk. Hey, great work on that framework, he said casually. The clients loved it. I looked up at him. You're welcome, I said. He blinked, slightly confused. For the support, I replied, calm and even. He shifted his weight. Right, yeah, it was a team effort. There it was again. Team effort. It's a beautiful phrase. It dissolves ownership into something polite and untraceable. That was the first small cut. Not because it was loud, not because it ruined anything immediately, but because something inside me registered the imbalance clearly for the first time. I wasn't invisible. I was useful. And usefulness without boundaries invites quiet erasure. I didn't snap that day. I didn't even push back. But I started documenting, not emotionally, strategically. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic happened. That was the problem. No one pulled me aside to apologize. No awkward tension filled the office. No visible shift in how I was treated. The machine kept running smoothly, and I kept feeding it. That's how normalization begins, not with a crash, but with continuity. A few weeks after the client presentation, we had an internal planning session for the next fiscal year. I had prepared a risk matrix highlighting 3 unstable revenue streams. I sent it to Mark the night before, clearly labeled, clearly structured. The next morning, he opened the meeting by projecting a slide titled, Revenue Risk Forecast, Preliminary. It was my matrix, reformatted, rebranded. My name has been removed from the footer. This is something I've been analyzing, he said, laser pointers circling the red zones. We need to think proactively. I watched the room nod, and this time something inside me didn't flinch. It observed. I noticed how smoothly it happened, how confidently, no hesitation, no guilt, just a seamless transfer of ownership, as if the ideas belonged to the air and he had simply gathered them. After the meeting, one of the senior partners stopped by my desk. Strong analysis, she said quietly. Keep feeding him insights like that. It makes the whole team look good. Feeding him, that phrase stayed with me longer than it should have. Around the same time, salary review season returned. I went in better prepared. I had a folder, printed metrics, client retention numbers, and documented efficiency gains. Mark skimmed them. You're invaluable operationally, he said. But from a leadership optics perspective, we need more visible strategic ownership. I held his gaze. I led the healthcare rollout framework. He smiled gently, the way someone does when correcting a child's version of events. You contributed significantly, yes, but Daniel carried the client-facing narrative. That visibility matters. There it was. Reality, rewritten with a warm tone. I walked out with a 3% raise. Inflation that year was higher than that. And here's the part I don't love admitting. I rationalized it. I told myself leadership perception takes time to shift. I told myself that pushing harder would make me seem difficult. I told myself that steady progress was more dignified than aggressive negotiation. I became very good at explaining away what was happening. When meeting invites excluded me from early-stage strategy discussions, I told myself they needed high-level alignment first. When I was asked to finalize decks I hadn't been consulted on, I told myself execution was my strength. When junior colleagues began bypassing me to present ideas directly to Mark, ideas they had refined with me first, I told myself mentorship was part of leadership. Each time the cut was small. Each time I stitched it close myself. What's dangerous about repeated dismissal isn't the volume. It's the subtle reshaping of your internal narrative. I stopped thinking, that was unfair. I started thinking, I should have positioned myself better. I stopped noticing the pattern externally. I internalized it. Even my language changed. Instead of saying, I led that project, I'd say, I supported the initiative. Instead of saying, that was my framework, I'd say, we collaborated on that. Language is powerful. It trains the brain. And mine was being trained into modesty so deep it bordered on erasure. But here's what they didn't see. Every time credit shifted, every time compensation stalled, every time history was gently rewritten, I logged it. Dates, context, exact phrasing. Not because I planned revenge, but because something inside me had stopped trusting the narrative being handed back to me. The disrespect wasn't loud enough to protest without looking overly sensitive. So I adapted. I smiled, I delivered, I documented. And slowly, quietly, the part of me that once believed patience would solve everything began to harden. Not into anger, into awareness. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to realize. I wasn't just experiencing random moments of dismissal. I had been cast. Every organization has informal roles that aren't written in job descriptions. There's the visionary, the rainmaker, the firefighter, the charmer. And then there's the stabilizer, the one who doesn't panic, the one who absorbs overflow, the one who fixes what others break, quietly, efficiently, without demanding spotlight. That was me. It wasn't assigned in a meeting. No one said, Clara, your role is to be useful but invisible. It was more subtle than that. It showed up in language. You're so grounded. You're our backbone. We don't know what we'd do without you. Compliments can be cages when they're used to define your ceiling. Backbone. Backbones don't stand at the front of the body. They support it. I started noticing the choreography of meetings more clearly. When a new initiative was announced, eyes would move toward Mark for vision, toward Daniel for client narrative, and toward me for logistics. Clara will figure out the workflow. Clara can clean this up. Clara will make sure it runs. Not lead, not own, not decide. Make sure it runs. One afternoon, during a leadership offsite planning session, I was asked to facilitate breakout discussions. Not contribute to strategy, facilitate. At one point, while capturing ideas on a whiteboard, I realized I hadn't spoken a single original thought in over an hour. I was translating everyone else's ideas into structured bullet points, and I was very good at it. That was the trap. Competence can quietly lock you into maintenance roles. Later that day, as we packed up, one of the partners laughed lightly and said, "Clara's the adult in the room. She keeps us from spiraling." I smiled. Inside, something clicked. They didn't see me as someone who could spiral because they didn't see me as someone who could rise. The stabilizer doesn't get promoted to pilot. The stabilizer keeps the plane steady while someone else sits in the captain's seat. The role wasn't maliciously assigned. It was convenient. I was reliable. I didn't challenge publicly. I didn't demand airtime. When conflicts emerged, I mediated instead of escalating. When resources were unevenly distributed, I redistributed my own time to compensate. I made it easy, and organizations reward what's easy for them. I began testing something quietly. In meetings, I started speaking last instead of first. I stopped volunteering to take notes. I waited to see if anyone else would step into the silence. The silence stretched longer than expected. Eventually, someone would glance at me. "Clara, do you mind capturing this?" Of course, because I always had. That's when I understood something painful but clarifying. They weren't underestimating me by accident. They were operating based on the version of me I had consistently shown them. Calm, capable, accommodating. There's a difference between being respected and being relied upon. I was relied upon. Respect, I was beginning to suspect, requires visible boundaries, and I didn't have any. Not externally. Internally, though, something had begun to shift. Not anger, not rebellion. Just a subtle refusal to keep shrinking. I still performed, still delivered, still maintained composure, but the part of me that once sought validation from their approval had started withdrawing. I no longer wanted to be their backbone. I wanted to know who I was without carrying everyone else's weight. And that question, that was the beginning of everything changing. It didn't happen during a confrontation. There was no dramatic email, no explosive meeting, no single sentence that shattered the illusion. It happened on a Tuesday morning, quietly, almost invisibly. I arrived at the office early, like I usually did. The city was still shaking off dawn, light filtering through the glass panels in a pale gray wash. The office was empty except for the cleaning staff and the hum of the HVAC system. I sat at my desk with my black leather notebook open. On the page, I had drawn 2 columns the night before. On the left, what I give. On the right, what I receive. Under what I give, the list was precise. Revenue protected. Clients retained. Systems rebuilt. Teams trained. Conflicts diffused. Late nights. Emotional labor. Strategic insight. Under what I receive. Stable salary. Positive feedback. Increased workload. Deferred raises. Rewritten credit. The imbalance wasn't emotional, it was mathematical. That's what made it so sobering. I wasn't being mistreated loudly, I was being extracted quietly. Around 9:15 a.m., an internal email thread began circulating. A potential new client, high visibility, major expansion opportunity. Mark had forwarded the opportunity with a short message. "Exciting, let's move fast. Daniel, can you draft a strategic outline? Clara, once direction is set, you can operationalize." Once direction is set, operationalize. I read the sentence 3 times. There it was again. The role, the ceiling. My cursor hovered over the reply button. For the first time in years, I didn't immediately respond. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence sit. I asked myself a question I had avoided for too long. If nothing changes, will I still be here in 5 years? The answer came quickly. No, not because I would be promoted, but because something inside me would erode beyond recognition. That realization didn't feel angry. It felt clean, clear. Around noon, I stepped outside to grab coffee alone. No laptop, no phone call, just walking. As I stood in line, I watched other professionals around me, people in tailored suits, startup hoodies, hospital scrubs. Everyone is moving with purpose. And I realized something uncomfortable. No one here knew I was underpaid. No one here knew my ideas had been reassigned. No one here saw me as invisible. The invisibility only existed in one building. That thought was destabilizing and liberating. When I returned to the office, I opened my notebook and turned to a fresh page. I didn't write complaints. I wrote options: stay and negotiate aggressively, transfer departments, begin external search quietly, document everything formally, leave. For the first time, leaving wasn't an emotional fantasy. It was a viable strategy. Later that afternoon, Daniel stopped by my desk again, energized about the new client pitch. Once I draft the high-level framework, I'll loop you in to refine execution, he said. Refine execution. I looked at him, not with resentment, but with new clarity. You should draft it however you think is best, I replied evenly. He smiled, unaware of the shift. And in that moment, something inside me disengaged. Not from my work, from the need to be seen by them. That Tuesday didn't end with fireworks. I didn't send any bold emails. I didn't confront Mark. I didn't demand anything. I simply stopped assuming this was permanent. And that small internal decision changed the way I sat in meetings the next day. Changed the way I read emails. Changed the way I listened. Because once you accept that staying is optional, your silence transforms. It's no longer endurance. It's preparation. The morning after that Tuesday, I walked into the office differently. Nothing visible had changed. I wore the same charcoal blazer, carried the same black leather notebook, smiled at the same receptionist, sat at the same desk. But internally, I was no longer negotiating for belonging. I was observing. In the weekly leadership sync, I took my usual seat halfway down the table. Mark opened with updates. Daniel presented a draft outline for the new client pitch. It was ambitious. It was also structurally unstable. Normally, I would have interjected early. There's a resource gap here. The timeline conflicts with Q3 capacity. We don't have back-end support for that scale yet. I could see the cracks forming before anyone else spoke, and I stayed silent, not out of fear, out of intention. I let the room praise the boldness. I let excitement build. I let commitments stack. I wrote in my notebook, projection exceeds current staffing by 32%. No one asked for my input. Eventually, Mark glanced in my direction. Clara, thoughts? In the past, I would have softened my tone to avoid disrupting momentum. This time I answered plainly. If we proceed at that pace, we'll need either 3 additional hires or revise client expectations. Otherwise, delivery risk is high. No emotion, no edge, just data. There was a brief pause. Mark nodded. Good point. We'll factor that in. And then the conversation moved on without recalibrating anything. I didn't push further. That was new. Before, I would have fought gently to make sure the operational realities were respected. I would have followed up with emails, offered alternative frameworks, and absorbed the adjustment workload myself. This time, I documented my statement and let it stand. Over the next few weeks, something subtle happened. Because I stopped overcompensating, small inefficiencies began surfacing more visibly. Deadlines slipped. Internal confusion increased. Junior associates started asking more questions I had previously anticipated and preemptively resolved. At first, no one connected it to me. They just assumed the firm was scaling rapidly. But I knew the difference. I had stopped cushioning impact. Silence, when it's no longer self-protective, becomes strategic. I still did my job. I still delivered what was assigned. I didn't sabotage. I didn't withdraw effort. I simply stopped doing the invisible extra layer that made everyone else look effortlessly competent. One afternoon, a client escalation call ran longer than expected. Mark texted me mid-call. Can you jump in and smooth this? They're frustrated. Normally, I would have entered the call with empathy calibrated, solutions prepared, tension diffused within minutes. Instead, I replied, in back-to-back meetings until 4, available afterward, which was true, but I could have rearranged. I didn't. When I joined later, the client's frustration was sharper. The cracks are more obvious. I addressed them calmly and professionally. But the delay had exposed something. Mark seemed unsettled afterward. Things have felt bumpier lately, he commented casually. I met his eyes. We're operating closer to capacity. He studied me for a second, as if trying to detect something different. There was nothing dramatic to see. That was the power of it. They mistook my restraint for fatigue, for distraction, for normal growing pains. They didn't realize it was intentional boundary setting without announcement. The office still saw me as steady, but internally, I was reallocating energy. I updated my resume quietly. I reconnected with former colleagues. I researched compensation benchmarks more seriously, and I continued documenting, not with urgency, with precision. The most interesting shift wasn't external. It was emotional. For the first time in years, I didn't feel anxious before performance reviews. I didn't replay conversations at night, wondering if I'd sounded too assertive or not assertive enough, because my future was no longer dependent on their perception. Silence had become a choice, and choice changes posture, even when no one else notices. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. I still arrived early, still carried my black leather notebook, still responded to emails with measured clarity. If anything, I became more composed. But under the surface, I was building something they never saw. The first thing I did was audit my own impact. Independently of the company's narrative, I pulled client retention reports going back 4 years. I cross-referenced implementation timelines before and after I restructured operational workflows. I calculated revenue preserved through crisis interventions I had personally managed. The numbers were irrefutable. Client churn dropped 26% in accounts I oversaw. Operational errors decreased by nearly a third after my system overhaul. 2 of our largest long-term contracts had been saved during escalations I had de-escalated alone. None of that had been publicly attributed to me, but it was documented. I organized everything into a private folder at home, not on company servers, not in shared drives. For the first time, I was assembling my story from data, not emotion. Then I expanded outward. I began studying compensation structures at comparable firms. I reached out discreetly to a former colleague who had left the industry 2 years earlier and moved into a director role at a competing consultancy. We met for coffee on a Saturday morning. She listened quietly as I described my responsibilities. Halfway through, she stopped me. "Clara, you're functioning at the director level. Why are you still titled operations manager?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was confused. I didn't have a clean answer. That conversation shifted something deeper than frustration. It reframed my self-perception. Back at work, I observed more carefully. I noticed how often Mark deferred operational complexities to me in private, then summarized them as his own strategic foresight in executive rooms. I noticed how Daniel's confidence had grown, built partially on scaffolding I had constructed. I noticed how often my inbox contained the phrase, "Can you just quickly?" Quickly became hours. Hours became weekends. So I changed one habit. When requests arrived without clear ownership or priority alignment, I responded with clarity instead of accommodation. "Happy to support. Which deliverable should this replace in my current queue?" It was a simple sentence. It forced trade-offs. Some requests disappeared, others were redirected. No confrontation, just boundary mathematics. Simultaneously, I began building external visibility. I updated my LinkedIn profile, carefully phrased achievements, measurable impact, neutral tone. I accepted 2 invitations to speak on small industry panels about operational resilience. The firm congratulated me publicly. They didn't realize it was positioning. At home in the evenings, I practiced something unfamiliar, negotiation out loud. I would sit at my kitchen table and rehearse clear statements without apology attached. My compensation is misaligned with the scope. I'm seeking leadership ownership, not just execution oversight. I'm prepared to transition if growth pathways remain limited. The first few times, my voice wavered. By the 10th time, it didn't. Meanwhile, inside the office, nothing looked different. I still delivered. I still solved. But I stopped volunteering invisible labor. When minor crises emerged, I allowed them to surface before stepping in. And something else began to shift, subtly. People started asking more direct questions. "Are you overloaded? You've seemed quieter lately." I smiled. "Just focused." That was true. Focused on leverage. Focused on clarity. Focused on ensuring that if I walked away, it would not be impulsive. It would be calculated. They never noticed the documentation growing. They never noticed the network expanding. They never noticed the shift from endurance to exit planning. Because I never announced it. Preparation is quiet when it's real. And by the time the high-stakes meeting approached, the one that would change everything, I was no longer reacting to disrespect. I was deciding whether to tolerate it at all. The leverage didn't arrive in a dramatic envelope. It revealed itself slowly through patterns. About 3 weeks before the high-stakes meeting, I was reviewing resource allocation projections for the upcoming quarter. The new client Daniel had pitched so confidently was moving forward faster than expected. Excitement filled the office. What no one seemed to fully calculate was dependency. I mapped out every active project, cross-referenced with internal staffing capacity, and overlaid that with client relationship touchpoints. One column stood out, accounts where I was the primary operational contact. Then I added another layer, accounts where clients had explicitly requested me by name during renewal conversations. It was higher than I anticipated. 42% of our recurring revenue touched me directly. Not the firm, me. I went deeper. I pulled email threads from past escalations, moments when clients had quietly expressed dissatisfaction before being stabilized. Again and again, the pattern was consistent. "Thank you, Clara. We trust your judgment. We're staying because you're overseeing this. Please keep us updated directly." It wasn't ego. It was structural reliance. The firm had built growth projections assuming my continued presence, without formally acknowledging that reliance in compensation or title. That was the first layer of clarity. The second came unexpectedly. During a budget alignment meeting, I gained access to preliminary partner distribution forecasts for the next fiscal year. As operations lead, I needed to model cost implications. Buried in those spreadsheets was something telling. Projected profit increases tied directly to the operational efficiencies I had implemented. They were planning expansion on top of systems I built, without adjusting my role accordingly. Not illegal, not unethical in an obvious way, just extractive. That afternoon, I closed my office door. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm. For years, the narrative had been subtle. You're valuable but not leadership material, essential but not strategic, reliable but not promotable yet. The data contradicted that narrative completely. I wasn't a support function. I was infrastructure, and infrastructure has power when it recognizes itself. I opened my notebook and wrote 3 sentences. They need my continuity. I have market value. I can leave. The third sentence was the most powerful, because leverage isn't about threatening, it's about options. That evening, I received an email from the director-level contact I had met weeks earlier. Her firm had an opening. Comparable responsibilities, director title. The compensation range is 35 to 40% higher than my current salary. They wanted to schedule a formal interview. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even tell anyone close to me yet. I simply replied, yes, available Thursday afternoon. The interview process moved quickly. By the second round, it was clear they understood my scope immediately. They asked strategic questions. They referenced my measurable impact. They didn't position me as support. They positioned me as leadership. The offer came in writing 2 weeks later. Director of Operational Strategy. Base salary is significantly higher. Performance equity is tied to growth. I printed the offer letter and placed it inside my black leather notebook, not as a trophy, as confirmation. For the first time in years, I saw my professional identity reflected accurately by strangers. Back at my current firm, the high-stakes client expansion meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. It would formalize commitments that relied heavily on operational execution. They expected me there. They expected stability. They expected continuity. They did not expect optionality. And I sat at my kitchen table that Sunday night, the offer letter in front of me, asking a single question. Do I negotiate or do I end it? For the first time, both choices felt real and irreversible. The offer letter sat inside my notebook for 3 days before I touched it again. I went to work as usual, answered emails, reviewed projections, sat in meetings where my input was acknowledged politely and then reframed strategically by someone else. Nothing had changed externally, but internally the weight had shifted. I had options now, and options create a dangerous kind of clarity. The high-stakes expansion meeting was scheduled for Monday at 10 a.m. It would finalize scope, budget, staffing commitments, and projected timelines for the new client, the one Daniel had pitched so boldly. The projections assumed full operational support. My support. Over the weekend, I laid out 3 paths on my dining table. Option 1, negotiate aggressively, present the external offer, demand title realignment, compensation correction, and formal authority over operational strategy. Option 2, stay quiet, accept the external offer, and provide standard notice after the expansion is secured. Option 3, make the break clean, immediate, public, irreversible. Option 1 was rational. It was mature. It gave them a chance to correct the imbalance. But I had a lingering question. If they needed an external offer to recognize my value, would that recognition ever be genuine? Option 2 was strategic. It would avoid drama. It would protect relationships. But it would also require me to sit in that Monday meeting, listening to commitments being made on the assumption that I would continue absorbing. Option 3 was the most disruptive. It would shift power instantly. It would force visibility. It would also close the door completely. Sunday evening, I replayed the past 4 years in my mind, not emotionally, but factually. The delay raises, the reassigned credit, the softened dismissals, the gentle rewriting of history. There had been multiple moments when they could have recalibrated. They hadn't. I asked myself something simple. If I walk into that room on Monday and say nothing, what message am I reinforcing? The answer was uncomfortable. I would be reinforcing that I am permanent infrastructure, regardless of how I'm treated, that my boundaries are flexible, that my patience is infinite. I closed my eyes and imagined a different scenario. The meeting begins, projections are reviewed, commitments are made. And then, the moment I slammed my resignation letter on the boss's desk, the image wasn't chaotic, it wasn't loud, it was controlled, not rage. Resolution. I wasn't fantasizing about humiliation or revenge. I wasn't imagining anyone panicking. I was imagining reclaiming authorship. The next morning, before leaving for the office, I printed my resignation letter. 1 page, concise, professional. Effective immediately, no accusations, no emotional language. I placed it inside my notebook, directly behind the offer letter from the new firm. 2 documents, 2 futures. As I walked into the office, everything felt unusually sharp. The hum of conversation, the smell of coffee, the quiet confidence in Daniel's voice as he reviewed the talking points. At 9:58 a.m., we gathered in the main conference room. Senior partners dialed in remotely. The client representatives appeared on screen. The slide deck opened. Daniel began presenting projected growth. Mark spoke about scalability. They committed to aggressive timelines. They referenced operational strength, my operational strength. And as the conversation escalated toward formal agreement, I felt the final hesitation dissolve. This wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about alignment. When Mark concluded a segment by saying, "Our operations team is fully equipped to execute this at scale," he glanced at me briefly for affirmation. I met his eyes, and I knew there are moments when negotiation is appropriate, and there are moments when silence would mean self-betrayal. I reached into my notebook and made my choice. Before I describe what happened in that room, before the letter touched his desk, I need to explain something important. What looked sudden wasn't sudden at all. By the time I walked into that high-stakes meeting, I had already moved. Not physically, strategically. 2 weeks earlier, after receiving the formal offer, I had consulted an employment attorney. Not because I intended conflict, but because clarity protects dignity. We reviewed my contract, non-compete clauses, confidentiality boundaries, notice requirements. There were no legal traps, no golden handcuffs. I could leave cleanly. I also met with a financial advisor. I calculated my savings runway, factored in health insurance transitions, mapped worst-case scenarios. If the new role collapsed unexpectedly, I had 8 months of stability. Fear thrives in vagueness. I removed vagueness. I signed the offer letter on the Friday before the Monday meeting, but requested the official announcement be delayed until I confirmed my departure timing. The new firm agreed. "Take the time you need," the hiring partner told me. "We want you clear, not reactive." That sentence stayed with me. Clear, not reactive. Back at my current firm, I adjusted quietly. I stopped building long-term internal roadmaps that extended beyond 30 days. I finalized documentation on core systems I had designed, but stored copies of process frameworks that were my intellectual contribution without breaching confidentiality. I organized my email archives. I removed personal files from my office drawer. None of it is dramatic, just tidy. The Friday before the meeting, Mark stopped by my desk. "Big week coming up," he said, smiling. "This expansion could be transformative." "For the firm?" I asked evenly. "For all of us," he replied. There was something almost ironic about that sentence. For all of us. He believed it. And that's what made this complicated. Mark wasn't a cartoon villain. He wasn't malicious. He was strategic in a way that prioritized growth and optics. He simply assumed I would always be there to operationalize the ambition. I went home that evening and reread my resignation letter one last time. No accusations, no emotional unloading, just 3 sentences. "I appreciate the opportunities I've had here. After careful consideration, I have decided to resign from my position, effective immediately. I will ensure a professional transition of active responsibilities within contractual guidelines." I printed 2 copies, placed them in my notebook, and slept better than I had in months. Monday morning arrived with a kind of quiet stillness. In the conference room, as projections flashed across the screen and commitments were verbally locked in, I didn't feel adrenaline. I felt detachment. When Mark referenced operational readiness and glanced at me for affirmation, I didn't nod. I closed my notebook instead. The sound was soft, but in that moment, it felt definitive. I waited until Daniel finished outlining the accelerated rollout schedule, one that depended heavily on my oversight. Then calmly I spoke. "Before we finalize this," I said, my voice steady, "there's something I need to address." The room shifted slightly, not alarmed, just attentive. I stood, reached into my notebook, and walked to the head of the table. The moment I slammed my resignation letter on the boss's desk wasn't violent. It wasn't theatrical. It was precise. Paper against polished wood. A boundary is becoming visible. "I won't be operationalizing this expansion," I said calmly. "I'm resigning, effective immediately. No raised voice, no shaking hands, just truth." The silence that followed wasn't chaos. It was comprehension, trying to catch up. And for the first time in years, I wasn't absorbing impact. I had redirected it. Silence behaves differently depending on who holds power. For years, I had held silence as endurance. Now I held it as leverage. When I placed the letter on Mark's desk and said calmly, "I'm resigning, effective immediately," the room didn't explode. It stalled. Daniel's expression shifted first. Confusion, then disbelief. One of the senior partners leaned closer to her screen, as if proximity would clarify what she had just heard. Mark didn't touch the letter right away. "Clara," he said slowly, "this isn't the time for theatrics." The word hung there. Theatrics. I met his eyes. "This isn't theatrical," I replied evenly. "It's aligned." The client representatives were still on the video call. Faces frozen in professional neutrality, but alert. Mark cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess," he suggested quickly. The call was paused. External parties are on hold. The conference room door closed, and then the shift began. "What is this about?" Daniel asked, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "This expansion relies heavily on your operational oversight," Mark added. "You're central to the structure." I nodded once. "Yes." There was no accusation in my tone. That seemed to unsettle them more than anger would have. One of the partners spoke from the screen. "Is this a negotiation tactic?" The question was direct, almost clinical. "No," I said. "I've accepted another role." That landed heavier. "Since when?" Mark asked. 2 weeks ago." He finally picked up the letter and scanned it quickly. "Effective immediately?" he repeated. "Yes." The room recalibrated. For the first time, the structure they had built, quietly assuming my continuity, felt unstable. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "We can't operationalize this timeline without you," he said, almost to himself. I didn't respond, because that sentence was the point. For years, my contributions had been framed as supportive, secondary, operational, not strategic. Now, in their absence, they were suddenly structural. Mark shifted tactics. "We could discuss adjusting your title," he said carefully. "Compensation. If this is about growth." "It's not about a reactive adjustment," I replied calmly. "No heat, just boundary." The partner on screen spoke again. "Clara, is there anything that would change your decision?" I considered the question, not because I needed to, but because it deserved honesty. "If recognition requires departure to be visible," I said evenly, "then the structure isn't aligned with how I want to operate." That wasn't an attack. It was a statement of values. The silence that followed felt different from the first one. Heavier, more aware. Mark leaned back in his chair, studying me as if seeing a new variable he hadn't accounted for. "When were you planning to tell us?" he asked. I just did. No bitterness, no triumph. Just clarity. Outside the conference room, the office continued its low hum, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, coffee machines whirring. Inside, the architecture of assumption had cracked. Eventually, Mark exhaled. "We'll need a transition plan," he said. "I'll provide documentation for current active projects within contractual boundaries," I replied. Professional, contained. For the remainder of that meeting, the expansion discussion felt muted, cautious, less confident. Not because I had sabotaged anything, but because reality had shifted. They weren't losing an employee. They were losing an unacknowledged pillar. And for the first time, they felt the weight I had carried quietly for years. By the end of that day, the tone of the office had changed. Not publicly, not dramatically, but perceptibly. Mark called an emergency leadership session after the client call resumed, without me leading any of it. I stayed in my office, documenting transition notes calmly, answering emails as if nothing seismic had occurred. Because for me, nothing seismic had. The decision had already been made weeks ago. Around 3 p.m., I was invited back into the conference room. The energy was different now, less confident, more careful. "We've recalibrated the rollout timeline," Daniel said, avoiding eye contact. "We may need to phase implementation." May need to. Earlier that morning, the expansion had been framed as bold and immediate. Now it was cautious and conditional. Mark folded his hands on the table. "Clara," he began, voice measured. "I want to revisit this. We may not have adequately recognized your scope." That sentence would have meant everything to me 6 months earlier. Now it sounded procedural. "I appreciate that," I replied. He continued, "If title alignment and compensation are part of this, we can accelerate those discussions. There's flexibility." Flexibility, the same word that had been absent during past review cycles. One of the partners added, "We don't want to lose you over misalignment," as if it were a minor clerical error. I listened quietly, not cold, not hostile, just complete. "I've already signed with another firm," I said evenly. "This isn't exploratory." That shifted the room again. "When do they expect you to start?" Daniel asked. 2 weeks. Mark exhaled slowly. "You could extend notice," he suggested. "Help us stabilize this transition." And there it was, the implicit acknowledgement. They needed stabilization. The stabilizer was leaving. I'll fulfill contractual obligations, I said. But I won't lead new expansion commitments. It wasn't punishment. It was a boundary. Over the next few hours, small tremors rippled outward. Junior associates stopped by my office, visibly unsettled. Is it true you're leaving? Yes, but you run everything. I smiled gently. No, I ran my part. Word traveled quickly. By the next morning, the firm's internal Slack channels carried an undercurrent of concern. Questions emerged that hadn't surfaced before. Who will oversee implementation audits? Who manages cross-department escalations? Who owns system architecture documentation? The answers were unclear, because ownership had never been formally structured. It had been absorbed. Mark stopped by my office late that afternoon, alone this time. No partners, no audience. You could have come to me, he said quietly. I met his gaze. I did, repeatedly. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Silence, not the strategic kind. The reflective kind. We thought you were steady, he admitted. I was, I said. That doesn't mean I was satisfied. There was no accusation in my tone, just a fact. He nodded slowly. I underestimated how central you were. That sentence hung in the air, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. And too late. By the end of the week, timelines were formally adjusted. Expansion scope reduced. Client expectations softened. Not catastrophically, but noticeably. The machine hadn't broken. It had slowed. And for the first time, they were recalculating without assuming I would absorb the friction. Sometimes organizations don't recognize value until absence forces measurement. But recognition after departure isn't restoration. It's realization. And realization, when delayed, doesn't reopen doors. It simply clarifies why they closed. My final week was quieter than I expected. No hostility, no cold shoulders, just a kind of subdued professionalism, as if everyone was recalibrating their internal maps. On Wednesday afternoon, Mark asked if I had a few minutes. We met in his office. The same glass walls, the same city skyline reflected behind him. The same space where I had once rehearsed polite requests for raises that never arrived. He didn't sit behind his desk this time. He chose the chair across from me. I've been reviewing your documentation, he began. It's extensive. I believe in clean transitions, I replied. He gave a faint nod. You've always been thorough. There was a pause, not awkward, just searching. I want to understand something, he said carefully. Why didn't you push harder? The question wasn't defensive. It sounded almost personal. I considered it honestly. Because I believed performance would speak, I said. And because every time I raised concerns, they were softened. He leaned back slightly. We never intended to diminish you. I know, I said. That seemed to surprise him. I don't think you were malicious, I continued. I think you were efficient. And I was convenient. He didn't argue. That was new. In leadership meetings, he said slowly, we talked about you as indispensable. Indispensable and promotable aren't the same, I replied. He exhaled through his nose, almost a quiet acknowledgement. You're right. There was no shouting, no list of grievances, no emotional unloading, just clarity. I built systems here, I continued calmly, but I never owned them publicly. That's partly on me. I accepted the stabilizer role. He studied me, as if recalculating his understanding. You're not angry, he observed. No, I said, and I wasn't. Anger had burned off weeks earlier, during the preparation phase. What remained was alignment. I don't want this to feel like we failed you, he said. I held his gaze. It doesn't feel like failure. It feels like a misfit. That word landed gently. Misfit. Not betrayal, not injustice, not war. Just a mismatch between value and recognition. He nodded slowly. If things had been structured differently, they weren't, I said softly. Another pause. What will you be doing, he asked. Director of Operational Strategy, I replied. A flicker crossed his face. Surprise, then something that looked like respect. That fits, he admitted. Yes, I said. It did. When I stood to leave, he extended his hand. I underestimated you, he said plainly. I underestimated myself, I replied. We shook hands. No bitterness, no reconciliation speech, no dramatic closing line, just acknowledgement. As I walked out of his office, I felt something unexpected. Lightness, not because they panicked, not because timelines shifted, not because they suddenly saw my value, but because I had confronted the situation without heat, without needing them to validate my departure, without rewriting the story to make myself the hero. I had simply stepped out of a role that no longer fit. And sometimes, the most powerful confrontation isn't loud. It's calm enough that everyone hears it clearly. It's been 8 months since that meeting. 8 months since the moment I closed my notebook, stood up, and redirected the trajectory of my own career. I'm now Director of Operational Strategy at a firm that introduced me to clients by saying, Clara leads our structural architecture. Not supports, not assists, leads. The first time I heard that phrasing, I felt something unfamiliar. Alignment, not because of the title. Titles fade quickly once daily work begins, but because my scope matches my authority. When I identify risk, it's discussed, not reframed. When I design systems, I own them publicly. When compensation is reviewed, it's tied transparently to measurable outcomes. The work is still demanding. The hours are still long during expansion cycles. There's still pressure. The difference is internal. I no longer feel extracted from. I feel positioned. In my first quarter, I implemented a cross-functional reporting model that clarified ownership across departments. Instead of absorbing overflow, I designed boundaries into the system itself. It's interesting what you build once you've lived without structure. I also changed something subtle in my leadership style. When junior team members contribute insight, I name them explicitly in meetings. That was Maya's analysis. James flagged that risk. I don't let ideas float anonymously, not because I'm compensating for my past, but because visibility is architecture too. Emotionally, I'm different, quieter in a steadier way. For years, my composure came from endurance, from bracing, from calculating how not to seem too much. Now it comes from congruence. If something feels misaligned, I address it early, calmly, directly, without apology layered into every sentence. I no longer rehearse conversations at night. I no longer measure my tone against imaginary accusations. And here's something I didn't expect. I don't resent my previous firm. They operated within their own incentives. I operated within my silence. We were all consistent. What changed was my threshold. There's a difference between being the stabilizer and being the strategist. The stabilizer absorbs. The strategist designs. For a long time, I confused quietness with smallness. They aren't the same. You can be soft-spoken and still decisive. You can be composed and still immovable. The moment I slammed my resignation letter on the boss's desk wasn't about anger. It was about authorship, about refusing to continue playing a role I had unconsciously accepted. Today, when I walk into a meeting, I still carry a slim black notebook. I still listen first. I still speak calmly. But now, when I finish a sentence, I don't shrink it afterward. I let it stand. And that, more than the new salary or title, is what feels like freedom. If you only saw the headline moment, the resignation letter placed on polished wood, the high-stakes meeting interrupted, you might think this story is about snapping. It isn't. It's about erosion. It's about what happens when subtle dismissal repeats long enough that you start editing yourself to fit it. No one screamed at me. No one publicly humiliated me. No contracts were violated. What happened was quieter. Credit shifted softly. Raises deferred gently. Roles are defined politely. And because it was polite, I tolerated it. The real turning point wasn't the day I walked out. It was the day I stopped assuming endurance was maturity. There's a narrative many of us inherit, especially if we're competent, composed, and not naturally confrontational. Work hard, stay steady, be patient. It will balance out. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, the cost isn't just financial. It's psychological. You begin to doubt your own scale. You start shrinking your language before anyone else does. You confuse being needed with being valued. The moment I slammed my resignation letter on my boss's desk was calm, not explosive. Because the decision had already been processed internally, I didn't leave to prove a point. I left because staying would have meant agreeing with a version of myself that was smaller than reality. There's no villain in this story, just misalignment sustained too long. If there's a lesson here, it's this. Silence is powerful, but only when it's chosen. If you're staying somewhere because you believe you have no options, that silence will erode you. If you're staying because you've consciously decided it serves you, that silence is strength. The difference is clarity, so I'll leave you with something to think about. In your own life, where are you enduring quietly? And where might you actually be ready to decide? I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye!